I sat at the dining table, staring at the half-empty glass of bourbon in front of me. The ice cubes had mostly melted, leaving the amber liquid diluted and unappealing, much like my life felt lately. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows through the blinds, cutting across the room like prison bars. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you think too much, hear too much, your own thoughts, your own mistakes. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. I was supposed to be at our friend's anniversary party. Ashley had gone ahead earlier, claiming she wanted to help set up. She insisted I come later since I had a late meeting with the boss. "Don't worry," she'd said, smiling over her shoulder as she slipped out the door. "I'll save you a plate." That smile, it used to light up my entire world. Now it just felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel it, like static electricity building in the air before a storm. The meeting had wrapped up earlier than I expected, so I decided to surprise her. I grabbed a bottle of wine from the store on my way and headed to the party. When I got there, though, something felt wrong. The house was lit up, music was playing, but Ashley wasn't anywhere to be found. Our friends gave me odd looks when I asked if they'd seen her. "She stepped out," one of them said, avoiding my eyes. "Stepped out," I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "Stepped out where?" They shrugged, offering no real answer. That's when I decided to leave, my chest tight with a mixture of anger and unease. Something wasn't adding up, and I wasn't about to stand around pretending everything was fine. Now here I was, sitting in our kitchen, replaying every moment of the past few weeks in my head. Ashley had been distant, distracted. She'd started coming home late, claiming work was busier than ever. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the missed calls, the cryptic texts, the way she'd pull away when I tried to get close, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. I grabbed my phone and opened the tracking app we'd installed a year ago, back when she'd gotten lost driving to her sister's cabin. I told myself it wasn't spying. It was concern. Her location popped up on the screen, a little blue dot hovering on the other side of town, far from the party. My heart sank. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be with our friends, celebrating their milestone, not wherever the hell she was now. I sat there for a moment, torn between calling her and driving over. Eventually, curiosity and dread won out. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The address led me to a modest motel just off the highway. Its neon sign flickered, buzzing faintly in the cold night air. My stomach churned as I pulled into the parking lot, parking a few spaces away from her car. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation, I told myself. Maybe she's meeting a friend, or something. But deep down, I knew. The truth was sitting heavy in my chest, suffocating me. I got out of the car and approached the front desk. The clerk barely looked up from his phone as I asked about her. "Room 214, he muttered, not even asking for ID. I nodded and climbed the stairs, each step feeling like it weighed a ton. The hallway smelled like mildew and stale cigarettes. I stopped in front of the door, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I considered walking away, pretending I'd never been here. But the need to know, to confirm the suspicions that had been gnawing at me, overpowered my fear. I knocked. There was a pause, and then I heard movement inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and there she was, Ashley. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes widened in shock when she saw me. "James," she stammered, stepping outside and pulling the door shut behind her. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, my voice trembling. "What's going on, Ashley?" She looked away, biting her lip. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, my patience snapping. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn bad." Before she could answer, the door opened wider, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a cocky smirk that made my blood boil. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, casually draping an arm around Ashley's shoulders. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed in, was crumbling. Ashley's eyes filled with tears as she looked at me, but I didn't care. Couldn't look at her. I turned and walked away, the sound of her calling my name echoing behind me. Back in my car, I sat in stunned silence, the weight of what I'd just seen crashing down on me. My mind raced with questions, anger, and heartbreak. How long had this been going on? Was it my fault? Could we fix this? But one question rose above the rest, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't reach. Who the hell was that guy, and why did Ashley think she could get away with this? The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, but I barely noticed. The shock of what I'd just seen was a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. My mind replayed the scene over and over again. Ashley's guilty face, the stranger's smug expression. Each time, it felt like another knife twisting in my gut. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed in front of me like a tomb. The lights were off, and the silence felt oppressive. I didn't bother turning them on as I walked inside. The darkness suited my mood. I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. How had it come to this? Ashley and I had been together for 10 years. We'd built a life together, made plans for the future. Sure, things hadn't been perfect lately, but what marriage didn't have rough patches? I'd always assumed we'd work through it. That's what we'd promised each other on our wedding day, after all. But now I didn't know what to think. The image of her with that man was seared into my brain, and no amount of rationalizing could make it go away. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Ashley. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her sit with the weight of her actions. But another part of me needed answers, needed to understand how we'd ended up here. "Come home," I finally replied. The minutes stretched into hours as I waited. I paced the living room, the anger and hurt bubbling just below the surface. By the time I heard her car pull into the driveway, I was a tightly wound coil, ready to snap. She walked in hesitantly, her eyes red and puffy. She'd been crying, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her. Not yet. Not after what she'd done. "James," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry," I repeated, my voice rising. "Sorry for what, Ashley? For lying to me? For sneaking around? For throwing away everything we've built?" "It's not like that," she said, tears streaming down her face. I made a mistake, but it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I demanded, crossing my arms. "Because right now, it looks like you've been cheating on me." She flinched at the word, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I didn't mean for it to happen," she admitted. "It was just, I don't know. I've been feeling so lost, so disconnected from us. And then he made me feel seen." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Seen," I repeated, my voice cracking. "You think I don't see you? You think I don't care? You've been so busy, James," she said, her voice rising. "Work, meetings, projects. You're always somewhere else. And I've been here, alone, feeling invisible." I shook my head, the anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. "So this is my fault?" I asked quietly. "You're blaming me for your choices?" "No," she said quickly. "I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain, to make you understand. I'm not proud of what I did, James. I hate myself for it. But I need you to know it wasn't about you. It was about me." I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we had, felt like a lie. "I need time," I finally said, my voice hollow. I can't do this right now." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand. I'll stay with my sister for a while." As she gathered a few things and left, the silence in the house felt even heavier than before. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, wondering how we'd ever find our way back from this. The days that followed felt like walking through a minefield. Everywhere I turned, there was a reminder of Ashley. The half-empty coffee mug she always left on the kitchen counter, her favorite blanket draped over the arm of the couch, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom. It was maddening, like she was both gone and still here, haunting me in ways I wasn't prepared for. I threw myself into work. The office had always been my escape, a place where the chaos of the world couldn't touch me. But even there, my mind wandered. I'd catch myself staring blankly at my computer screen, replaying our last conversation over and over. Her words echoed in my head like a bad song I couldn't shake. She said she felt invisible, disconnected. Had I really been so blind? Had I been so consumed by my own world that I'd missed hers crumbling right in front of me? I hated her for what she'd done, but I couldn't deny the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been the husband I thought I was. On the third night, after another restless evening staring at the ceiling, I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I knew could give me some clarity. My older brother, Mark. Mark and I were close, the kind of close that comes from growing up in a house where our parents' shouting matches were the background noise to our childhood. He'd always been my rock, the one person I could count on to tell it to me straight, even when I didn't want to hear it. He answered on the second ring. "Hey man," he said, his voice warm but tinged with concern. "I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "Not quite," I replied, forcing a laugh. "You got time to talk?" "For you? Always. What's going on?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Saying it out loud made it real, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But I needed to get it out to make sense of it. "Ashley cheated on me," I said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. There was a pause on the other end, and then Mark let out a low whistle. "Damn, James."
I'm sorry.
"Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "Do you know who the guy is?" "No," I admitted. "Some random guy, I guess. I didn't stick around to get his life story." Mark sighed. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It sucks. It's gonna hurt like hell for a while. But you need to figure out what you want to do next. Are you thinking about divorce?" The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. Divorce felt so final, so absolute. And yet, it had crossed my mind more times than I could count. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to walk away to start over, but part of me still loves her. I don't know if I can forgive her, but I don't know if I'm ready to let go, either." "That's normal," Mark said. "You're in shock right now. Take some time to process everything before you make any big decisions. And don't do it alone. Talk to someone, a therapist, a pastor, whatever. Just don't let this eat you alive." "I'll think about it," I said, though the idea of spilling my guts to a stranger wasn't exactly appealing. "Good," he said. "And James? Don't blame yourself. She made her choices. Whatever issues you two had, cheating wasn't the answer." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Thanks, Mark. Anytime, little brother. Call me if you need anything." After we hung up, I felt a little lighter, like some of the weight had been lifted off my chest. But the relief was fleeting, and the questions remained. The next morning, I decided to follow Mark's advice and look for answers. I didn't go to a therapist, though. Instead, I started digging into Ashley's life, the texts, the emails, the social media accounts we'd shared passwords for back when trust wasn't an issue. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A string of messages between Ashley and someone named Ryan painted a picture I didn't want to see. They weren't overly explicit, but the undertones were clear. Late-night chats, inside jokes, mentions of missing you. It made my stomach turn. The messages started about 6 months ago, around the same time Ashley had begun pulling away from me. The guy wasn't a stranger, either. He was one of her coworkers, someone I'd met at her office Christmas party last year. I remembered him vaguely. A tall, lanky guy with glasses and a nervous laugh. He'd seemed harmless at the time, but now, seeing his name attached to my wife in ways that felt too personal, too intimate, I wanted to punch a hole in the wall. Armed with this new information, I felt a renewed sense of anger and betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was deliberate. This was planned. I decided I wasn't going to sit back and let this guy think he could walk all over me. If Ashley thought she could keep this from blowing up, she was dead wrong. But as I sat there, staring at my phone, a part of me hesitated. Did I really want to confront her again? Did I want to throw this grenade into our already fragile relationship? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The days turned into a week, and the emptiness of the house became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator, it all reminded me of what was missing. Ashley's absence felt like an open wound, raw and aching, but I wasn't sure if I missed her or just the version of us that used to exist. I busied myself with routine, work, the gym, cleaning the house even though it didn't need it. Anything to avoid sitting in the quiet. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the questions lingered. What did she mean by feeling seen? How had we let things fall apart so completely without realizing it? One night, after downing my third glass of bourbon, I opened my laptop and searched for couples therapists in the area. The idea had been nagging at me since Mark suggested it, but my pride had kept me from following through. Now, with the alcohol loosening my inhibitions, it seemed less like a surrender and more like a necessary step. The next morning, I called the first name on the list, Dr. Emily Harper. Her voice was warm but professional as she explained her approach to therapy. A mix of individual and joint sessions to help us unpack the layers of resentment, hurt, and miscommunication. She offered me a slot for the following Tuesday, and I took it without hesitation. When I texted Ashley about it, she replied almost immediately. "I'll be there," she wrote.
No hesitaschen, no excuses.
For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. The session was held in a cozy office downtown, with soft lighting and walls lined with bookshelves. Dr. Harper greeted us with a calm smile, ushering us to a couch that felt both too close and too far apart for comfort. "I know this is difficult," she began, her voice steady and reassuring. "But the fact that you're both here says a lot. It shows that, on some level, you're both willing to fight for this." I wasn't sure about that, at least not yet, but I nodded anyway. Dr. Harper started by asking us to share how we felt. Not about the affair, but about the state of our relationship before it happened. Ashley went first, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I just felt invisible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "James, you were always so busy with work, and when you were home, it felt like you weren't really here. I know you love me, but I didn't feel it anymore. And then Ryan." She hesitated, glancing at me nervously. "He noticed me. He listened. It wasn't supposed to go beyond that, but it did. And I hate myself for it." Hearing his name, Ryan, was like a slap to the face, but I bit my tongue, forcing myself to listen. Dr. Harper turned to me. "James, how did you feel during this time?" "Honestly," I said, my voice bitter, "I felt like I was doing everything I could to keep our lives running. I was working long hours to make sure we were secure, that we could have the life we always talked about. I didn't realize she was feeling this way because she didn't tell me, or if she did, I didn't hear it. And now, it's like all of that didn't matter." Dr. Harper nodded, her expression neutral. "It sounds like both of you were operating on assumptions about what the other needed, rather than communicating those needs directly. That's not uncommon in long-term relationships, but it can lead to a breakdown if it's not addressed." I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, we're definitely broken down now." "Broken doesn't mean irreparable," Dr. Harper said gently. "It means there's work to be done. The question is whether you're both willing to do that work." I glanced at Ashley, who was staring at her hands. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. "I am," she said softly. "I'll do whatever it takes, James. I know I messed up, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." Her words hit me hard. I wanted to believe her, to believe that we could somehow fix this. But the anger and hurt were still too fresh. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, my voice cracking. I don't even know where to start. You start by being honest, Dr. Harper interjected, with each other and with yourselves. This won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But if you're both committed, it's possible to rebuild trust and reconnect. I nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was a chance to start over, to build something stronger. As we left the session, Ashley and I walked to our cars in silence. The air was thick with unspoken words, but for the first time in days, it didn't feel hostile. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, her voice trembling. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "One step at a time," I replied, echoing Dr. Harper's advice. Ashley smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her tear-filled eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days after our first therapy session were a strange mix of hope and tension. Ashley stayed at her sister's house, giving us both the space Dr. Harper suggested. It felt surreal to wake up alone, to make coffee for one instead of two. But in some ways, the distance was a relief. It gave me time to think, time to untangle the knots of anger, betrayal, and confusion swirling in my head. I buried myself in work during the day, but the evenings were the hardest. That was when the memories crept in. Lazy Sundays on the couch, late-night talks that stretched into the early hours, the way she'd always steal the last bite of dessert when she thought I wasn't looking. I hated that even now, after everything, part of me still missed her. By the time our next session rolled around, I was anxious but determined. If there was any chance of salvaging our marriage, I needed to understand not just what had happened but why. Dr. Harper's office felt warmer this time, like the space had absorbed some of the vulnerability we'd poured into it during our first visit. Ashley and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, an unspoken agreement to keep our distance. "How have you both been since our last session?" Dr. Harper asked, her gaze flicking between us. "Better, I guess," Ashley said hesitantly. "Being apart has given me time to reflect. I've been journaling like you suggested, and it's helped me see things more clearly." "And you, James?" Dr. Harper prompted. I hesitated, unsure how to put my thoughts into words. "It's been hard," I admitted. "But I've been thinking a lot about what Ashley said last time, about feeling invisible. I guess I never realized how much I took her for granted." Ashley looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise. "You didn't take me for granted," she said quickly. "You were working hard for us, for our future. I see that now. I let my own insecurities get the better of me." Dr. Harper held up a hand, gently interrupting. "It's good that you're both acknowledging these feelings, but let's dig a little deeper. Ashley, when you say you felt invisible, what exactly do you mean?" Ashley took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. I felt like James was always focused on something else, work, deadlines, meetings, and when he was home, it was like his mind was still there. I tried to talk to him, but it felt like he wasn't really listening. I know it wasn't intentional, but it hurt. Her words stung, but they also rang true. How many times had I brushed off her attempts to talk because I was checking emails or preparing for the next day? How often had I told myself there'd be time for us later, only to let that later slip further and further away? "And Ryan?" Dr. Harper asked gently. "What role did he play in all this?" Ashley's face crumpled with guilt. "He gave me what I felt I was missing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Attention, validation, the feeling that I mattered. I know it was wrong, and I hate myself for betraying James. But at the time, it felt easy. Easy. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Our marriage hadn't been easy in a long time, but I'd thought that was just part of the deal. You work through the hard times, push past the rough patches, because the commitment you made to each other meant something. But for Ashley, it seemed the temptation of easy had outweighed the promise of forever. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay composed. "What about now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Do you still want easy?" "No," she said quickly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I want us, James. I want to fix this, to fix myself. I know it's going to take time, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Dr. Harper leaned forward, her hands folded in her lap. It's clear that there's still love between you, she said. But rebuilding trust is going to require honesty, patience, and a willingness to face some uncomfortable truths. Are you both ready for that? I hesitated, glancing at Ashley. Her expression was a mix of hope and fear, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Yes, I said finally. I'm ready to try. Ashley nodded, her voice trembling as she echoed my words. Me too. That night, I drove home alone, but for the first time since this whole mess began, I felt a spark of hope. It was faint, like a candle flickering in the wind, but it was enough to guide me forward. The days turned into weeks after Ashley left for her sisters, and I did everything I could to avoid confronting my feelings. Work became my sanctuary, a place where I could bury myself in spreadsheets, meetings, and deadlines. But no amount of numbers or professional achievements could fill the gaping hole her absence left behind. Every corner of the house felt haunted. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered in our bedroom, and the kitchen table, where we used to share late-night conversations over ice cream, felt unbearably empty. I found myself alternating between anger and sorrow, replaying every argument, every missed moment, every time I'd chosen work over us. The anger was easier, kept the pain at bay, gave me something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping through my fingers. But it also kept me from moving forward. Dr. Harper's office had become a strange kind of refuge. The sessions were painful, often dredging up things I'd rather leave buried, but they were also illuminating. Ashley and I still met weekly, sitting across from each other as we unpacked the mess of our marriage. Some days were better than others. I think we're getting somewhere, Dr. Harper said during one session, her voice calm and measured. But there's a piece we haven't addressed yet. James, how do you feel about forgiveness? The question caught me off guard. Forgiveness? I hadn't even thought about it. Every time I looked at Ashley, I saw the man from the motel, the smug look on his face, the way he'd casually draped his arm around her. Forgiveness felt impossible, like trying to climb a mountain with no summit. I don't know, I admitted. It's not that simple. Forgiveness never is, Dr. Harper agreed. But it's not about excusing what happened or forgetting it. It's about deciding whether the relationship is worth rebuilding. Ashley looked at me then, her eyes pleading. I know I hurt you, James, she said softly, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me. But I need to know if you think we're worth saving. I didn't answer right away. The truth was I didn't know. One evening, after another long day at work, I came home to find a letter on the dining table. It was from Ashley, her handwriting neat and careful, like she'd rewritten it a dozen times before leaving it here. James, I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am, not just for what I did, but for the way I let us drift apart. I should have talked to you sooner, told you how I was feeling, instead of seeking validation somewhere else. I don't expect you to forget or even forgive right away, but I hope you'll remember the good times we shared, the love that brought us together in the first place. I believe we can find our way back to that, even if it takes time. I love you, always, Ashley. I set the letter down, my chest tight. Her words were sincere, but sincerity didn't erase the betrayal. Still, there was a part of me, small but stubborn, that wanted to believe her, that wanted to believe we could fix this. The next session with Dr. Harper was different. For the first time, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to let the walls I'd built around my pain crack just enough to let some light in. I don't know if I can ever fully trust her again, I said, but I also don't know if I want to let go of what we had, what we still might have. Ashley's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of guilt or shame. They were tears of hope. Rebuilding trust is a long process, Dr. Harper said, but it starts with small steps. Are you both willing to take those steps together? I looked at Ashley, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, I saw not the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman I'd fallen in love with. The woman who, despite her mistakes, was still fighting for us. "I'm willing," I said, my voice steady. Ashley reached for my hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let her. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were easier than others, and there were moments when the pain resurfaced, sharp and unrelenting. But with every session, every honest conversation, we began to piece our marriage back together. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. An understanding glance, a shared laugh, the quiet moments where we simply sat together, rebuilding what had been broken. In the end, it wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward together one step at a time.